So welcome everyone again, and again tonight's talk is about awakening and its 7 factors. In other words, the 7 factors of awakening. And during this retreat, we've mentioned earlier the 4 establishments of mindfulness. The 4th establishment is represented by Analayo's wheel as the 6th and the 7th spoke. In fact, the 4th establishment of mindfulness in the Satipatthana Sutta has a number of different subdomains, I suppose we could call them. But I think that probably the 2 most important subdomains are what Analayo talks about in his seven spokes of the wheel, which are the 6th spoke of the wheel represents the hindrances, and the 7th spoke represents the awakening of the awakening factors. So what these 2 aspects of the 4th foundation or the 4th establishment focus on is causes and conditions. And what we focus on is causes and conditions in order to overcome the negative influence of the hindrances and in order to nourish the 7 factors of awakening. So it's all about understanding causes and conditions, understanding how things arise and how they can be shifted and changed. So every day we've been going over the 5 hindrances, and day by day we've been working through the 5 hindrances. And tonight I'm not going to give much detail on the hindrances, and I want to focus on the 7 factors. However, we haven't talked about doubt yet. So just to give you an understanding of what doubt is, I'll just clarify this a little bit more. So doubt refers to being having self-doubt, and also doubt in the practice, doubt in the validity and the validity and the benefits of the practice and the teachings. Sometimes it manifests as self-doubt, and also chronic uncertainty and chronic procrastination. Often it manifests as being perplexed, and it's unhealthy skepticism about the path, unhealthy skepticism about the benefits of the teachings and the practice, so much so that it paralyzes us. So in reference to that bowl analogy, doubt is like the bowl being filled with mud and put into a dark space, put into darkness so we can't really see clearly. And it's also, if we chose to work through it, it's kind of, there's a lot of resistance of working through the mud or moving through the mud. So every morning, or sometimes in the evenings during this retreat, I've been talking about the antidotes for the hindrances, and talking about how they manifest and so on. What I haven't talked about that much, although I've mentioned it, is what it's like to be free from the hindrances. I've mentioned this, but I haven't gone into much detail. So when we think of sensual desire, it's like we are in debt to our desires. And when we think about the affliction of ill will or aversion, it's like we're having an affliction, where it's like we're psychologically ill, afflicted by an illness. And when we talk about sloth and torpor, it's like we're imprisoned. We're imprisoned by our sloth and torpor. And when we talk about restlessness, it's like we are slaves to our restlessness. And before I talk to you about what it's like to be free from doubt, something about doubt, this chronic procrastination, this chronic uncertainty, this chronic feeling perplexed, it is like it's been compared to a person at a fork of a road, not knowing which direction to take, so they don't take any direction. They just get kind of frozen and paralyzed in that fork of the road. So to be free from doubt, to be free from the experience of doubt, is like reaching a destination with all our possessions and unharmed after an arduous and dangerous journey. So I guess those two analogies brought together, you could say that someone makes a decision to go down a particular pathway and then completes that journey on that pathway. So I think it's really helpful to know those, what it's like to be free from the hindrances. Because in my experience, when we can actually even experience just temporary freedom, which is what we tend to do when we sit to meditate, we can see what's happening with the hindrances, we can review them, we notice them, and then we can kind of put them aside. Well, sometimes we can. Even to the extent that we can put them aside temporarily, we can rejoice in that freedom from the hindrances. And that rejoicing gives us joy, and it's a kind of portal into the 7 factors of awakening. So the 7 factors of awakening are these. Mindfulness is the first one. Investigation of dhammas, second one. The third one is energy. The fourth one is joy. The fifth one is tranquility. The sixth one is samadhi or concentration. And the seventh one is equanimity. So I'm going to be talking about the features of each of these factors, and I'll stay with equanimity a little bit because that's worthwhile discussing and clarifying. And then I'll talk about where we go from there, what happens once we arrive at the culmination of these factors. So first of all, the Sariputta is a famous disciple of the Buddha. His right-hand person compared the 7 factors of awakening to a wealthy person choosing their wardrobe for the day, depending on where they're going and the conditions and what they wanted to do. It's like he would say he chooses which factor he will dwell in for the day, like a wealthy person chooses their garments for the day, chooses their clothes. So we can cultivate these factors one by one. We can cultivate them individually, and that's for great benefit. However, they are also known to be, like we can put that garment on, we can put the garment of mindfulness on for the day, or we could cultivate particularly tranquility for the day, or for the week, or a retreat, or whatever. So it's wholesome and it's very powerful to be able to cultivate these individual factors. However, they are also considered to be in a kind of a sequence. Like sometimes they're compared to branches on a tree that grows out. Like it starts with mindfulness and it branches into investigation of dhammas, and then it branches into energy, and so on and so forth. One affects the other. They influence one another, and they kind of nourish each other. Sometimes it's related to branches on a tree, and sometimes it's like these awakening factors are like buds of a flower. They sprout and they open, and they're very, very beautiful when they're nourished and they receive the right conditions. So tonight I want to talk about how we cultivate them in that sequence. So the first factor is mindfulness, and as we've been talking about for the last 6 days, I think, 6 days, or 6 nights, mindfulness is knowing and being aware and being present. It is being awake. And as Analayo Analayo describes it. It is soft, awake presence. It is this being aware and being attentive and remembering to be aware and attentive of immediate experience with care and discernment. Mindfulness cannot be taken away from the context of the path. It cannot be singled out as an individual, separate thing, because it's dependent on the whole path. And the path is dependent on mindfulness. It kind of brings that together, and they work together. All the factors on the Eightfold Path work together in an integrated way. I've talked about this on the first night. So in the Kaya Sutta, the Buddha spoke about how the factors of mindfulness can be nourished with attention. In fact, in this sutta he talks about the factors of the whole seven factors being nourished with attention. And what happens with this is that we remember factors associated with mindfulness, and in that way our attention and putting our attention to remembering factors associated with mindfulness, in that way we nourish them. We nourish this quality. So remembering to orient to the present, remembering to notice when mindfulness has arisen, remembering to be softly awake and present. We could use personification of mindfulness as a supportive friend, for example. Just remembering to bring attention to experiences. These are all ways we can use attention to nourish and nurture mindfulness. And when we get the mental flavor of it, when we are mindful, when we're practicing mindfulness, when we're remembering to be attentive to experience, remembering to see into experience, remembering to track what happens with experience, remembering to know the what and the how, and see that this experience with what it is and how it is changing. When we remember to see these various aspects of experience, it leads on to a kind of an investigation of dharmas. We naturally incline to be curious about these experiences. Being curious about these experiences, being interested in what's happening, this represents the second factor of awakening, investigation of dhammas. Dhammas, by the way, a dharma is a unit of experience. There's lots of dhammas. I know dharma refers to the truth and the teachings of the Buddha as well, but when it's talked about in this sense, when it's talked about, like we can talk about Buddha Dharma, and that's one sort of meaning, but dhammas, the meaning of a dhamma is a unit of experience. It is my perception of this bell striker. That's a unit of experience. It's a dhamma. Hope that makes sense. But anyway, so what we're doing with this second factor is we're investigating dhammas. We're investigating experiences. We're bringing interest and curiosity to experiences. We're looking in deeply to how this arises and what happens when it arises and how does it disappear and how experience changes. So there is a statement in that sutta again, the Kaya Sutta, and it goes like this: and what, bhikkhus, is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen factor of discrimination of states? That's discrimination of states is another way of describing investigation of dhammas. For the fulfillment by the development of the arisen enlightenment factor of discrimination of states, there are bhikkhus, wholesome and unwholesome states, bright states and their counterpart, blameless states and blamable states, inferior and superior states, dark and bright states and their counterparts. Frequently giving attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the enlightenment factor of discrimination of states. In other words, when we contemplate the arising and passing of experiences, when we investigate into dark states, light states, wholesome states, unwholesome states, when we're investigating into life in general, when we're investigating into experience, what happens is we start to have wisdom. I mean, this is a factor of wisdom. The other thing that happens is we start to feel a kind of an energy, I guess you could say kind of an inspiration or an enthusiasm. And this leads on to the next factor, the factor of energy. The energy factor, also called effort sometimes, probably energy is a better word for it. It is about persevering with something. I mean, often they talk about energy as being balanced, not too much or not too little, not too slack and not too enthusiastic. And I think in the suttas, the Buddha compared, I was speaking to a bhikkhu who was so energetic that he was walking all the time, doing a lot of walking meditation, extreme amount of walking meditation, so much so that there was blood on the pathway from his feet walking along the pathway. And this particular bhikkhu, before he ordained as a monk, he was a musician. He used to play whatever is equivalent to a guitar, like I think it must have been a lute or something like that in the times of the Buddha. And the Buddha called him over, and at that time there just happened to be a boat going down a river that they were close to. And in the boat, someone was playing a lute. I think they might have been getting a lesson. And the Buddha explained to asked this bhikkhu, he said, "Tell me, what happens if you tune the strings too tightly on your lute or a guitar? Call it a guitar if you want." He said, and he responded, "It sounds terrible. It doesn't sound right. It's not in tune. It's really, gives a horrible sound." And the Buddha said, "What happens if you make it too loose? Loose or tight?" "Oh, it sounds terrible." "So what do you do?" "Oh, we balance the tuning on the guitar string to just the right pitch. And then we have a harmonious and melodious sound. It's a lovely sound." And the Buddha said, yes, this is the same with your practice. Not too much effort, not too much energy, and also not slack, not sort of sitting back and being slack. So in terms of energy, there is something called the 4 right exertions. And these 4 exertions relate to the amount of arousal and energy put forth to, 1, prevent the arising of unwholesome states. 2, to abandon when an unwholesome state has arisen, abandon that state. 3, the energy involved in helping wholesome states arise or nourishing wholesome states to arise. And 4, the energy involved in maintaining or persevering or preserving wholesome states of mind. So that's a good way of understanding energy, I think. And sometimes I've been talking about the importance of making motivations at the beginning of every meditation practice, or making your intention. And on a recent retreat, it really became evident how that's so important, especially when our egos begin to drop away. Like often we're pushing ourselves, and it's based on this kind of ego desire. We're pushing ourselves for something or other. When that drive starts to fall away, we begin to see that the momentum of our practice is kind of like going into a stream, like how you're going, if you put something into a stream, it just moves along in the direction of the stream. For me, it's felt like that. It's like, because I've made a firm intention at the beginning that I'll practice in order to be awakened for the sake of all beings, I notice that when the ego starts to drop away and I let go of that ego pushing, there seems to be an energy that comes from my intentions. It's like dropping something into a stream and it just moves along effortlessly from an ego, but there's this lovely movement, there's a perseverance, and you're kind of in the current of going towards something. So that is energy. And when we start to get into the practice and, we establish our mindfulness, we investigate, we start to have this energy. Something happens then, and it is joy, because it is so joyous. We're realizing something. We're realizing we're moving away from these binds of suffering that we're caught in. We have a wholesome joy arise. So joy is the next factor of awakening. And in my view, joy gives us the juice for the practice. I think I mentioned this on the first night, the importance of joy. And I was talking about how we train pets and animals. We don't train them with punishment. We train them with positive reinforcement. I mean, that's the best way to deal with behaviors. If we want to change someone's behavior, not that we should change their behavior, but the best thing to change behaviors is positive reinforcement. Punishment is good to stop a behavior, but it's not good to learn a new behavior. So joy is like this. It gives us some positive reinforcement for the work of our practice. And it is work. It's really hard work. It's the most difficult thing we could do, to go against the stream of our kilesa, to go against the stream of our unwholesome behaviors, our unwholesome habits, our unwholesome patterns. This takes a lot of work. One of the descriptions of meditation is gamathan. Gamathan, it means work, working. So this is hard work, and it's great to be reinforced. So this gives us, joy gives us spiritual pleasure. And we've talked about, the other night I talked about Vedana, how important spiritual pleasure is. And I think it kind of nourishes us on the way. And in terms of that sutta again, there are things that are for the basis of the enlightenment factor of rapture. It's also called rapture, by the way. Rapture, joy, piety as well. But there are certain ways that we can nourish this. And Lisa and I will give a talk on this on Saturday night. And those of you who may leave the retreat early, you're welcome to come back for that talk. You're welcome to come back for anytime you like, actually. But we will give a talk. Lisa will give a talk on joy, and I'll give a talk on appreciative joy. There are ways that we can cultivate joy. So not only the factors of awakening, but we can cultivate joy through being generous. We can cultivate joy through dharna. We can cultivate joy through initial and sustained application. Remember that how I was talking about the factors in Serenity Meditation, like we begin with initial application, then sustained application. It's like putting our attention. The initial and sustained application will eventually bring joy, piety. we can look at the success of even temporarily putting the hindrances at bay, having some abeyance of them, some way of putting them aside. That will also bring joy. And I think it turbocharges the practice. So tranquility is the next one. Tranquility. It's another positive spin-off of waking up, actually. Tranquility is helped by bringing attention to it. The sutta talks about there are bhikkhus, tranquility of body and tranquility of mind. In other words, the body can be relaxed and the mind can be calm. And frequently giving careful attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of tranquility, and for the fulfillment of the by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of tranquility. That's what it says in that sutta. Kaya Sutta. So the way we can think about this practically is that when we're doing, say, a yoga nidra in the morning with Lisa, and we're feeling the bliss of relaxation, the how lovely this is, how nice it feels to breathe in, breathe out, and relax, to feel that spiritual pleasure. It's good to pay attention to that. It's good to see it. It's good to remember it. And we can actually, it's something like bodily memory or muscle memory. It's like when we pay attention to it, then we can remember it next time. I like to try to have a power nap every day, even at work. When I've got a nice big lounge in my room. Those of you who've ever been to my room, my office, big lounge. I like to take off enough time at lunchtime to have at least 20 minutes lie down. And I like to be horizontal. So I do that. And because I can remember what it feels like to relax, I don't kind of muck around, thinking about the phone calls I've got to make and all the rest of it. Sometimes I do, but if I can remember, and if I can bring wise attention to the what it feels like to relax, then it helps me bypass all that other stuff and go and use my time, which is sometimes I like to have 20 minutes, but just sometimes I just got to have 5 minutes. So even if it's a 5-minute excuse me power nap, it's enough for me to kind of go into that state of relaxation. And the same with calm, the calm mind. When we become familiar with a calm mind, when we pay attention to what it's like, when we pay attention to the factors associated with a calm mind, like when we concentrate our mind, when we concentrate, we notice there's a calmness arise and a tranquility arise. So the point I'm making is to pay attention to when you are tranquil, pay attention to when you are tranquil in mind and body, and remember that. Remember how you got there. Remember the factors associated with that. And that will enhance this capacity to find tranquility or to be tranquil. So the next factor is concentration. And when we are tranquil, our minds can focus. They're not distracted by things. We're not distracted by restlessness, for example. We're not distracted by the hindrances. When we can put the hindrances at bay, actually, what happens is the result of that is just a natural concentration. We naturally become focused. So when we can experience tranquility, there's nothing distracting us, there's nothing pulling our attention away. We're able to put our attention where we direct it. And what happens is our attention and our mental energies are gathered together and focused. Gathered together, collected together. Sometimes it's like a focus, but sometimes it's just more like a settling, like a stabilizing. This gathering together of attention, gathering together of mental energies, going in the same direction, not distracted. So this is the factor of concentration or samadhi. And in that sutta, there are bhikkhus, the sign of serenity, the sign of non-dispersal. Frequently giving careful attention to these signs is the nourishment, is the nutriment of the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of concentration, and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of concentration. Do you remember how in the Serenity talk and also in the practices, we talked about finding signs of concentration? And there are, these are called nimittas in Pali. And when we're working on developing the jhanas and the higher jhanas, they say one must find a nimitta that's like a light and use that as a way of entering the jhana. So I also mentioned that sometimes nimittas or signs can be very simple and basic. And I mentioned how, for me, there's a particular recognition of when I'm feeling metta, for example, or warm loving kindness, or when I'm feeling compassion, or when I'm feeling appreciative joy, or even when I'm feeling equanimity. And it's like a sign for me. It's like, rather than just kind of letting it come and go, I pay attention to that sign and I can get absorbed into it. So it becomes a tool for me. So that's what they're saying here. There are signs of non-dispersal. In other words, there are signs of a collected mind. And becoming familiar with them, getting to know them, is a useful way of becoming concentrated. So when we do come concentrate, I've just written something here. I just want to read it. I think I've mentioned what I've written there. Okay, so we're coming to equanimity now. Equanimity. And I've mentioned this term a few times. And I understand that, I don't know if there's a word for it in Chinese or not. But I know some of our Chinese friends have been learning some new words, and equanimity is one of them. So I'm glad that someone's learning a new word. Because equanimity is the culmination of the 7 factors. So what is equanimity? Equanimity is a quality of being centered and stable and emotionally balanced and unshaken in the midst of the 8 worldly winds. What are the 8 worldly winds? The 8 worldly winds are praise and blame, loss and gain, pain and pleasure, and fame and disrepute. These things that we spend our lifetimes when we're engaged in the world, either pushing away or seeking. We like to have praise, we don't like to have blame. We like to have pleasure, we don't like to have pain. We like to gain things, we don't like to lose things. And the fame and disrepute, I guess you could say at a basic level, fame is like social acceptance and disrepute is like social rejection. We are very much in tune to wanting to be accepted and not rejected. We spend our lifetimes in the world with these 8 worldly winds, these 4 polarities. Equanimity is unshaken by them. Equanimity is kind of still and peaceful with that. It's not being driven to grasp after anything, and it's also not being aversive to reject things. It is just stable and centered. The word for equanimity, other words for equanimity include peacefulness, impartial responsiveness, calm, still, stable, unshaken, even-handed, serene, impartial, and equipoise. Now, technically, equanimity is one of the features of the fourth jhana. It's the features of the third and the fourth jhana. So the third jhana has equanimity plus happiness as its feature. So sometimes you could describe that as contentment. The fourth jhana has equanimity as its feature. And it's described as not joyous, no joy, no pain. Sorry, no joy and no aversion. There's no, one is completely still and quiet, peaceful. Joy is a bit too much. So when we're talking about equipoise, and I'm trying to reflect what I've heard from Analayo, the way Analayo describes equipoise, and he uses the term equipoise in relationship to the seven factors. He's talking about how we're not pushed by joy. It doesn't have joy in it. It is, equanimity doesn't have joy in it, but equipoise, because it's the result of the seven factors, has joy as part of it, if that makes sense. So anyway, long-winded explanation of why I'm using the word equipoise, but that's another word for it. In Pali, it's called upekkha, and literally this means to look over, to see with patience, and also to see with understanding. It's like perspective taking. It's like sitting back from afar and having a view from afar to see the bigger picture. And as well as the result of insight and serenity, equanimity is also one of the four divine abodes. And we've been talking about the four divine abodes, and I mentioned that the four divine abodes have near and far enemies, if you remember that. The far enemy is its direct opposite, and the near enemy is a false representation of this quality. So the far enemies of equanimity are being emotionally overreactive to changing life events. Another one is feeling responsible for other people's actions. Another one is taking everything personally. Another one is having poor relationship boundaries, being caught up in the push and pull of attraction and aversion. Being concerned about rejection and acceptance and so on. Another far enemy is this kind of compulsiveness, uncenteredness, basically. The near enemies are interesting. The near enemies include a kind of a disinterested indifference, a disengaged indifference, a disengaged kind of flatness, even a dissociation. I would go as far to say it's a kind of a distant impartiality. It's not an engaged impartiality, as is with the genuine representation of equanimity. And sometimes people who are experiencing, and I've had this experience myself, that near enemy of equanimity, the one that is like a false facsimile of equanimity, we make too many boundaries. We cut off. We distance ourselves in a cut-off way. And we even can have a kind of an aloof superiority. It's like somebody falls over and hurts himself, and we say, oh, that's their karma. Interestingly, in the four divine abodes, one way of remedying this near enemy is by cultivating compassion. It's like compassion brings softness and sensitivity to this aloof, cut off, disengaged sense of superiority and distant impartiality. It brings softness to it. So it's a remedy for the near enemy of equanimity. So, how do we cultivate it? In the sutta, it says things like paying attention to factors that are related to the cultivation of equanimity. So, what I understand by cultivating equanimity is that equanimity arises as a result of living with ethical integrity. That's one way. Another way it arises is as a result of insight. When we practice noticing experience, when we see that experience is impermanent, it's not self, that its nature is dukkha as well. When we begin to understand things, when we begin to see cause-effect relationships to experience, in that way we begin to understand that everyone is on their own life trajectory, that everyone is the owner of their own actions. They are heir to their actions. They are born of their actions. They are related to their actions. They are supported by their actions. Whatever actions they shall do, of those actions they shall be the heir. And I'm just quoting one of the recollections, some of the words from the 5 recollections, which I might talk about later. So equanimity is a wisdom quality. It's understanding that actions have consequences and that each and every individual has to be responsible for their own actions because nobody else can be responsible for them. Sometimes it's difficult to kind of take on or understand. When I've taught about equanimity in groups of lots of lay people or in my clinical practice, sometimes I've talked about equanimity with when I was working in community mental health. We used to do workshops and courses on that included understanding about equanimity. People used to say, well, how can every individual be responsible for their actions? What about children have been sexually abused or children have been really hurt and harmed, and surely that's not their responsibility? And I would say to them, well, look, it's not our fault the way we are, but it is our responsibility. Because I've seen lots of adults who have been abused as children. I've seen when I was working with children and adolescents, I saw children and adolescents who were being abused and being hurt and harmed. And still, even though I wanted to go in and fix them up, I wanted to change them somehow, I wanted to heal them, I had no power to do that because they had to heal themselves. This is the reality of it. And this is what's difficult for parents when we see our children suffering. We want to go in and fix it up. And of course we can provide the circumstances that are most helpful for this. But in the long run, we have to accept the fact that this individual has to heal within their own system somehow. They have to, we can't go in and do it, if that makes sense. So equanimity is seeing that. Equanimity is knowing that. So another way of cultivating equanimity is Serenity Meditation, of course. Becoming very still, calm, so still and quiet that it feels like, and this is the analogy that's used in the suttas about this particular, the 4th jhana. They describe it like a person covered in a sheet that's luminous. So what that suggests to me is that they're somehow insulated from the pains of the world, insulated from the 8 worldly winds, at the same time as being brilliantly aware of it, immersed in it. They are clear and perceptive and awake and aware. And another feature of this particular jhana is light, brightness, which I think symbolizes this awareness, this bright awareness. of knowing things, yet one is not caught up in it. One is not caught up in the ways of the world, but we can be aware of them. So these 7 factors of awakening, they work together wonderfully. I think earlier in the week I talked about how we can use them to benefit our practice. And one way I used to understand these, and I still understand them like this, in terms of the first 3 factors, like mindfulness, investigation, and energy, they represent insight. They represent the factors of cultivating insight. It's interesting that equanimity is the result of insight as well. It's the state. Equanimity could be described as the state of mind of awakening, the state of mind of insight. It's the way insight manifests. We'll have an insight, but the way it manifests in our day-to-day activities and life is as equanimity. So those first 3 factors represent insight. The next 3 factors represent serenity, joy, tranquility, and concentration. And if you look into the features of jhanas or the features of Serenity Meditation, it has joy and it has tranquility, and it's also primarily about this gathering in of attention and collection of attention, putting it in one spot. And equanimity is both the result of serenity and also insight. So that's one way of understanding these 7 factors. Yet another way, and I'm describing what Analayo describes as what he calls as Energizers and Karmas. So in this case, he separates mindfulness as always being there. Mindfulness is sort of always present and overseeing the other factors. And if we're feeling sluggish in our practice, if we're feeling a bit kind of, maybe not even to the point of sloth and torpor, but kind of a bit slack, what we do is we can energize our practice. We energize them with investigation of Dhamma, dharmas. We energize them with energy, and we energize them with joy. So these are energizers. And if we're feeling a bit kind of too gung-ho and it's a bit, overactive or over-energized, what we can do is we can engage the calming factors. And these he relates to as being tranquility, concentration, and equipoise. And Analayo describes it like paddling down a river. And the river's leading to the ocean of awakening. And on this, when we're paddling down the river, we have this paddle, and sometimes we might be going off course, so we slow ourselves down a bit to get back on course by stopping the water. Other times we might steer our boat in a different way so that we're energizing it. So calming and energizing, just balancing this pathway to awakening. So we have these 7 factors of awakening, and this is the common. This is the seventh spoke in Analayo's wheel of Satipatthana. And at the core, at the middle of the hub of the wheel, we have mindfulness of body. And around the outside of the rim of the wheel, we have something called dwelling independently without clinging to anything, which I would say would be unawakened perspective. These 7 spokes in the wheel work together with and lead towards this dwelling independently. So what happens after the 7 factors of awakening? What happens in this path to awakening? What is it? that leads to awakening? What is it that happens after the 7 factors of awakening? Well, what they talk about is, first of all, seclusion from the hindrances. We have seclusion from the hindrances. Then they talk about dispassion. Then there's talk of cessation. And then there's talk of letting go. And letting go is nibbana. So, seclusion from the hindrances. When the hindrances no longer block our path, no longer pull us back, no longer obstruct us, then we begin to see things as they are. We begin to see that all things are impermanent. And rather than grasping after things, rather than craving things, experiences, we have what's called dispassion, meaning we're not buying into it. We're not going out grasping things. We don't have the cause of suffering being craving. We don't have that anymore, so there's no more suffering. Well, the suffering's starting to reduce. When we have dispassion, and this is subtle, we no longer go out and want for anything anymore. We're no longer feeding into the creations of experience. Remember how I talked about craving gives rise to, grasping gives rise to clinging, grasping, becoming, and so on and so forth. We get caught in cycles of creation. We get caught in what's called samsara. We're constantly creating things, grabbing onto them and getting caught up in them. So when we're secluded from the hindrances, we have dispassion. And then with dispassion, we notice things arise and we notice that they pass away. And we let them pass away. We let them disappear. And there's no more grasping after more arisings. So this is what's called cessation. No longer are we feeding into the creation of our suffering, and we're letting suffering cease. And then it eventuates in us letting go. Letting go. Letting go into nibbana. No longer creating the cause of suffering. Therefore, we have no more suffering. The freedom of awakening. So, I've come to the end of the talk, I think. I think that's a good place to finish. Complete awakening. So I hope that the talk has been helpful, and I wish the development of 7 factors of awakening to lead to seclusion, dispassion, cessation, and letting go. May you all be happy, peaceful, and completely free. Thank you.